Name the American general who commanded the army that landed at Omaha Beach, broke out of Normandy, took the first German city, crossed the Rhine first, and shook hands with the Soviets on the Elbe. Most people reach for 3 names before they land on the right one. Eisenhower ran the theater from a headquarters in England and France. Bradley commanded the army group above him. Patton commanded the army beside him, and Patton made sure everyone knew it. The man who actually commanded the largest single American field army in the European theater of operations for 337 straight days of combat gave exactly 1 press conference in the entire war, a fact that, once you know it, tells you almost everything you need to know about why this documentary needs to exist at all. His name was Courtney Hicks Hodges, and by the time you finish this, you will understand both why his record should put him in the first rank of American commanders of the Second World War, and why it very deliberately does not. I want to say something before I start, because this channel does not do hagiography, and Hodges does not need it. This is not a story about a secret genius who deserved a statue and never got one. Parts of his record are genuinely admirable. One part of it, which I will get to directly and without softening it, is the worst managed battle any American army fought in the European theater. Both things are true about the same man, and a documentary that only tells you one of them is not telling you the truth. What follows draws on the operational histories of the First Army's campaigns, the post-war memoirs of the men who served above and beside him, and the diary his own headquarters staff kept in real time, sources that, taken together, leave very little genuine mystery about what happened. The mystery is not in the record, it is in why so few people have ever read it. Start at West Point, because that is where most American general officer biographies of this generation begin, and Hodges is the exception that makes the rule visible. His family background gave no obvious hint of the unconventional path ahead. The Hodges line traced back to English settlers who arrived in America in 1750 and later put down roots in Houston County, Georgia. A great-grandfather had fought in the Revolutionary War, and 4 great-uncles had served the Confederacy, so soldiering ran in the family even if the specific route Hodges took to it did not. His father, John Hicks Hodges, owned the local paper, the Houston Home Journal, which made the family reasonably prominent in a small town, without making Courtney a guaranteed candidate for the officer corps. He finished Perry High School in 1903, spent a year at North Georgia Agricultural College, and then transferred to West Point, entering the United States Military Academy on June 16, 1904, at 17 years old. 11 months later, on June 17, 1905, the Academy found him deficient in mathematics and sent him home. His own class, the class of 1909, would go on to commission George S. Patton, who had himself been held back a full year at West Point for failing the same subject Hodges failed outright. One future Army commander stumbled on the mathematics requirement and recovered inside the system. The other one did not recover inside the system at all. He left it and had to build an entirely different door to walk back through. What Hodges did next is, in my opinion, the single most revealing fact in his entire biography, more revealing than anything that happened at Aachen or the Rhine. He did not sulk. He did not use a family connection to get a second chance at the academy, though his father certainly could have tried. He went home to Perry and worked behind the counter of a general store for the better part of a year, and then, on November 5, 1906, walked into Fort McPherson, Georgia, and enlisted as a private in Company L of the 17th Infantry Regiment. If the institution would not commission him, he would outperform every enlisted man in it until the institution had no honest choice left. He rose to sergeant inside 3 years and became, by any measure, an exceptional soldier, placing second in the entire United States Army at the National Marksmanship Contest at Fort Niagara, New York, while still wearing enlisted stripes. In 1909, he sat for the Army's competitive examination for prospective officers, a narrow and deliberately punishing pathway. Tactics, military history, mathematics, field exercises, that in practice almost nobody used, because the American Officer Corps of 1909 ran almost entirely through West Point or personal connection. Hodges passed it. On November 13, 1909, he was commissioned a second lieutenant of infantry, the same year his former West Point classmates received their commissions at graduation. Ask yourself what that actually required. Not talent alone. The Army had plenty of talented privates who stayed privates. It required a specific, stubborn refusal to accept that one closed door was the only door that existed. The years that followed read, in hindsight, like a roster of the men who would eventually run the largest army the United States ever fielded.
Hodges served in the Philippines and, in 1916, rode with Pershing's punitive expedition into Mexico, chasing Pancho Villa, a campaign that put him in the field alongside a young cavalry officer named George Patton and a staff officer named George Marshall, the future Army Chief of Staff who would, 3 decades later, decide which of his old colleagues got which command. Marshall, Patton, and Hodges, riding through the same dust in 1916, would all hold major commands in the next World War. Only one of them would be forgotten, and it was not going to be decided in Mexico. In World War I, Hodges went to France with the 6th Infantry Regiment, 5th Division, and fought through some of the hardest ground of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest American operation of the war. Near Brieux, on the Meuse River, in the first days of November 1918, days before the armistice ended the entire war, Hodges personally reconnoitered the riverbank under fire to find a crossing point, organized an assault party, and led it across after the first attempt collapsed under German fire. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest award for valor, along with the Silver Star. The man who spent the interwar decades as a quiet staff officer and the man who personally led an opposed river crossing under fire were the same person. That is not a biography that reads like a bureaucrat's. The interwar Army sorted its future leadership at Fort Benning, and Hodges ended up at the center of it. He served on the infantry board at Benning from 1929 to 1933 under Colonel Joseph Stilwell during the exact years historians now call the Benning Revolution, the period when George Marshall, then assistant commandant of the infantry school, was deliberately identifying and cultivating the roughly 200 officers he believed could lead the next American army. Hodges was inside that circle, and he did more than pass through it. On the infantry board, he was directly involved in the decision to adopt the M1 Garand as the Army's standard infantry rifle, a semi-automatic weapon at a moment when the German and Japanese armies were still issuing bolt-action rifles, giving the American rifleman roughly double the rate of aimed fire of his enemy counterpart. He also contributed to the development of the steel combat helmet and to improvements in field rations. None of that makes for dramatic documentary footage. Nobody storms a beach carrying a committee report. But every American infantryman who carried a Garand from Omaha Beach to the Elbe was, in a very literal sense, carrying part of Hodges' work, years before the war that would make him famous even started. He taught tactics at West Point from 1920 to 1924, the first non-graduate ever placed on the Academy's faculty, which means the institution that expelled him for failing mathematics brought him back specifically to teach its cadets how to fight. In the years between, at Langley Field, Virginia, on loan from the infantry school to teach at the Air Corps Tactical School, Hodges met Mildred Lee Buckner of Montgomery, Alabama, the young widow of an Army flight surgeon. He courted her, by every account that survives, in a way entirely consistent with the rest of his personality, walking his dog with her and taking her out to the shooting range rather than to dinner or the theater. They married on June 22, 1928, and had no children. It is a small detail against the scale of everything else in this story, but I think it fits. A man who never once tried to make himself the center of attention proposed to his future wife, by most accounts, right there on the firing line. By 1938, he was assistant commandant at Benning. By October 1940, commandant of the entire infantry school, the single most important training post in the peacetime army. When he moved up to become Chief of Infantry in May 1941, the man who replaced him as Commandant of Benning was Omar Bradley. Sit with that succession for a moment. Marshall spotted the talent, Hodges built the doctrine those officers would fight with, and Bradley trained the men who executed it. And then all three of them went to war together, with Marshall running it from Washington, Bradley commanding a field army and later an army group, and Hodges eventually commanding the largest field army of them all. Here is a detail that belongs in this section and rarely appears anywhere. When Third Army shipped to England in January 1944, its commanding general was not yet George Patton. It was Hodges,
who had built and trained Third Army as a stateside training command through 1943 before handing it over. Patton took command of a fully organized, fully trained army and, 6 months later, took it across France at a pace that made him famous. The men who build the instrument and the men who play it in front of an audience are, very often, not the same person. That is a pattern worth remembering, because it is going to repeat. On August 1st, 1944, at 9 in the morning, Omar Bradley formally handed command of First Army to Hodges, who had served as his deputy since before D-Day, specifically so that this transition could happen smoothly the moment Bradley moved up to command 12th Army Group. Before that handover, though, it was Hodges' own First Army, under Bradley's overall command, but built and staffed by the men Hodges would inherit, that carried out the actual amphibious assault on June 6, 1944. Roughly 60,000 soldiers and 6,500 vehicles hitting Omaha and Utah beaches, with the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropping inland ahead of them in the dark. Casualties by midnight ran past 6,000, the overwhelming majority of them at Omaha, where the terrain and the depth of German defense turned the landing into the single bloodiest few hours any American unit endured in the entire European campaign. Utah, by comparison, came ashore relatively lightly. First Army on that day controlled roughly 250,000 men across 3 corps. At its peak, it would command 18 divisions, the largest American field army fighting in Europe. And here is the part of the story that the popular narrative consistently gets backward. First Army did not get the glamorous war. Patton got the pursuit across France, the wide-open tank country, the newspapers. Hodges got the hedgerows, Aachen, the Hurtgen, and the northern shoulder of the Bulge. In other words, First Army drew almost every assignment on the European map that involved grinding, attritional combat against a defending enemy, rather than chasing a retreating one. The Normandy hedgerow fighting that Hodges inherited was brutal in a way pre-war planning had not anticipated. The Bocage country's centuries-old earthen embankments, 3 to 12 feet high and topped with dense hedgerow growth, turned every field into a small fortress that had to be cleared individually, at close range, under machine gun fire from the next hedgerow 50 to 100 yards away. In 17 days of that fighting, First Army took roughly 40,000 casualties, advancing about 7 miles, nearly 6,000 casualties per mile of ground gained, with some rifle companies losing 60% of their enlisted strength. Operation Cobra, the concentrated bombing and breakout attack launched July 25th, finally cracked the German line open, though at a terrible cost of its own. A short bombing run killed 111 Americans, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater, identified afterward only by the stars on what remained of his uniform. What followed, in the first 2 weeks of September 1944, is arguably the least told part of the entire story, and I think it deserves to be told plainly. While Patton's Third Army raced across relatively open country to the south, Hodges' First Army advanced roughly 200 miles in 11 days, trapped some 25,000 German troops in the Mons pocket, and became the first Allied army to cross the German border on September 11, 1944, a pace so far ahead of pre-war planning assumptions that historians have calculated First Army reached positions nearly a year ahead of the original invasion schedule's projections for that date. The Mons encirclement itself was closed almost by accident. First Army's 7th Corps under J. Lawton Collins was driving east so fast that it overran retreating German columns before German commanders even realized American forces were behind them, folding 2 entire corps' worth of disorganized troops into a pocket nobody on the American side had specifically planned to create. Not Third Army, not the British, First Army. Aachen followed in October, Charlemagne's ancient coronation city.
the first German city to fall to any Allied army, taken after 10 days of house-to-house fighting so severe that more than 85% of the city was left in ruins. Hitler had ordered it held to the last man. The German garrison commander surrendered on October 21st. It was, again, entirely a First Army operation, fought by the 1st and 30th Infantry Divisions under Hodges' overall command. Now I have to tell you the part of this story that does not flatter Hodges, because leaving it out would turn this into an advertisement rather than an honest account. The Hurtgen Forest campaign, fought from mid-September 1944 into December along roughly 50 square miles of dense fir forest on the German-Belgian border southeast of Aachen, stands today as one of the worst planned and most costly battles the United States Army fought anywhere in the Second World War. The tactical case against it is not something I am asserting on my own authority. It is close to a professional consensus among the historians who have studied it. The forest itself conferred almost no benefit on the attacker. Artillery detonating in the dense canopy sprayed wood splinters and shrapnel down onto men who had no ground cover to escape it, a phenomenon soldiers called tree bursts, and the terrain of steep ravines and narrow fire breaks channeled every advance into a killing zone the German defenders had already registered with mortars and machine guns. On October 6th, 2 American regiments needed 5 days of fighting to advance 1 mile to the first forest clearing. The 9th Infantry Division then spent 10 more days pushing a second mile. That 2-mile advance cost close to 5,000 casualties. The decision that troubles me most, and the one I think a fair accounting has to lay specifically at Hodges' feet rather than at some abstract high command, involves Major General Norman Dutch Coda and the 28th Infantry Division. Coda had earned the Distinguished Service Cross on D-Day, personally leading survivors off Omaha Beach. By October 1944, he was considered one of the most capable division commanders in the theater. Ordered to take the town of Schmidt by direct assault through the worst of the Hurtgen terrain, Coda protested the plan to both his corps commander and to Hodges directly, warning that a frontal attack through that specific ground was likely to fail at unacceptable cost. He was overruled. The attack went forward on November 2nd, and the single supply route supporting it, a narrow logging track called the Call Trail, turned out to be barely passable even for jeeps, let alone the tanks and half-tracks meant to reinforce and resupply the advance. Vehicles slid off the trail into the ravine, wounded men waited hours for evacuation along a route German artillery had already registered, and within days the attacking regiments were cut off from their own supply chain in terrain American planners had never adequately reconnoitered before committing troops to it. The operation collapsed within days into one of the costliest divisional defeats of the American war in Europe. What happened afterward is the detail I think belongs in this story and rarely gets told. After the failure, Hodges personally reprimanded Coda and recommended to 5th Corps Commander Leonard Giraud that Coda be relieved of command. Giraud declined to act on the recommendation, not by most accounts because Coda's performance had been strong, but because the Hurtgen fighting and Hodges' own earlier relief of other commanders had already thinned the available pool of officers experienced enough to replace him. Coda kept his division. His reputation never fully recovered. There is a second, darker thread running through the 28th Division's autumn of 1944 that most accounts of Hodges leave out entirely. And I think it belongs here because it says something about the command culture First Army was operating under at exactly this moment. Private Eddie Slovic, a rifleman in the 28th Division's 109th Infantry Regiment, deserted his unit that autumn and was court-martialed for desertion. Coda, as his division commander, confirmed the death sentence. Slovic was executed by firing squad on January 31, 1945. The only American soldier executed for desertion since the Civil War, out of literally tens of thousands of desertion cases prosecuted in the European theater, the overwhelming majority of which resulted in prison sentences rather than death. I am not going to tell you Hodges personally decided that case. He did not. The chain of confirmation ran up through Eisenhower himself. But it happened inside the same division, in the same terrible autumn, under a command climate where Hodges had just publicly tried to relieve that division's commander for a battle Hodges himself had ordered. Whatever you conclude about individual responsibility, that convergence of facts, a division wrecked by an attack its commander had warned against, and a private from that same division executed as an example while the general who ordered the attack faced no comparable consequence, is the kind of detail that belongs in an honest account of this general's command, not a footnote.
By the time the Hurtgen fighting wound down in mid-December 1944, First Army had absorbed something close to 33,000 battle casualties, for ground that a number of the historians who have studied the campaign most closely, Charles MacDonald, who fought there himself as a company commander among them, argue should have been bypassed entirely by attacking around the forest rather than through it. Some accountings run considerably higher once non-battle losses are folded in. Trenchfoot, frostbite, and combat exhaustion cases pushed total First Army losses in the Hurtgen toward 55,000 by the more comprehensive estimates, in a campaign fought for roughly 50 square miles of forest that had no strategic value anyone could clearly articulate at the time. Part of what makes the campaign so hard to defend in hindsight is that its stated purpose kept shifting as it went on. The Ruhr River dams, which controlled the water level of the entire Cologne plain, and which eventually became the operation's official justification, the fear being that Germany could open the floodgates and drown any American force attempting to cross the river downstream, were not, by most historians' reading of the record, the objective First Army's planners had foremost in mind when the offensive was first launched in September. The dams became the retroactive explanation for a battle whose original purpose had been to clear what planners assumed, wrongly, would be a minor tactical nuisance standing in the way of a push toward Cologne. Both the credit and the failure belong to the same command, and I don't think you can honestly tell this story by keeping only one of them. Bradley approved the operation's scope, and Eisenhower did not intervene to stop it. But Hodges dictated the specific attack plans, overruled the division commander who had personally proven his courage on Omaha Beach, and then tried to make that same commander the scapegoat when the plan he had approved failed. I don't think you can understand what happened 4 days later when the Germans struck the Ardennes without understanding how badly bled First Army already was going into it.
A word here about how Hodges actually ran an army day to day, because it matters for understanding both the achievements and the Hurtgen failure in the same light. A typical morning at First Army headquarters began around 6:30 with a staff briefing at which Hodges reviewed the overnight reports and interrupted only to ask a question, never to make a speech. He frequently flew low over his own front lines in a Piper Cub liaison plane to see the terrain his men were actually fighting through, rather than relying entirely on map symbols pinned to a board in the rear. And he was, by a wide margin, the most willing of any American Army commander in the theater to remove a subordinate who was not performing. Over the course of the war, he relieved 10 of the 13 corps and division commanders who served under him, the highest relief rate of any field army commander in Europe. Some of those reliefs were plainly justified by the record. Others, in the judgment of several post-war historians, and by my own reading of the Coda case specifically, look considerably less fair in hindsight than they must have looked from Hodges' own headquarters at the time. A commander who demanded performance because he had personally earned every rank he held applied without much patience for men who had not. That tension is closer to the real Courtney Hodges than either the flattering version of this story or the purely critical one. I'd ask you directly, if you've made it this far, does a battlefield record like this, genuinely first-rate at Aachen, the Mons Pocket, and Remagen, genuinely troubling at the Hurtgen, deserve to be remembered as a whole, warts included, or does the Hurtgen failure alone disqualify a commander from the credit the rest of his record earned? I don't think there's an obviously correct answer, and I'd rather hear yours in the comments than pretend I've settled it for you. The German Ardennes offensive struck on December 16, 1944, hitting First Army's overextended front with 25 divisions, including 10 Panzer and Panzer Grenadier formations, against a sector held by only 4 American divisions, 2 of them fresh and untested, 2 of them exhausted survivors of the Hurtgen fighting that had ended barely 4 days earlier. The 106th Infantry Division, on the line for less than a week, lost 2 entire regiments surrounded and forced to surrender on the Schnee Eifel, nearly 9,000 men, the largest single American surrender in the European theater. Hodges moved fast in the opening hours, ordering the 101st Airborne to Bastogne and releasing the 7th Armored Division to defend Saint-Vith before noon on the first day. Decisions that,
Whatever else is said about his conduct during the following week, denied the German offensive the road junctions it needed to sustain its own momentum.
He also ordered Matthew Ridgway's 82nd Airborne Division north to Verbemont, with instructions that amounted to a single sentence: locate and destroy Kampfgruppe Piper. As SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper's spearhead pushed deep into First Army's rear area, its lead elements came within roughly a mile and a half of an American fuel depot at Stavelot, holding more than 2 million gallons of gasoline, fuel Piper's own tanks desperately needed, and never found, because a scratch force of American rear echelon troops set the depot's perimeter ablaze and blew a key bridge, convincing German scouts the route ahead was already burning. By December 22nd, Piper's task force, which had entered the battle 6 days earlier with roughly 4,800 men and over 100 tanks, was down to around 800 men and no fuel at all, encircled at La Glaise and preparing to abandon its vehicles and walk out on foot.
Hodges, meanwhile, relocated his own headquarters from Spa to Chaudfontaine, as Piper's advance threatened to overrun it directly. An evacuation conducted quickly enough that classified maps were reportedly left still pinned to the walls of the abandoned command post at the Hotel Britannique. Both versions of events appear in the record, and a full account has to hold them together rather than pick the more convenient one. Multiple post-war accounts, Anthony Beever's History of the Ardennes among them, describe Judith as suffering what several officers around him at the time called a form of physical and nervous collapse during the worst days of the crisis, compounded by a case of influenza. Beaver specifically noted that visitors to First Army's headquarters during this stretch came away disturbed by the disorganized atmosphere they found there. Field Marshal Montgomery, given temporary command of 1st and 9th Armies on December 20th, after German penetration severed communications with Bradley's headquarters, reportedly asked Eisenhower for permission to relieve Hodges outright. Eisenhower refused, describing Hodges to Marshall as the reticent type, who did not appear as aggressive as he actually was. Hodges was genuinely exhausted, running an army that had just been bled white in the Hurtgen and was now facing the largest German offensive on the Western Front, and the army held anyway, because the critical early decisions, Bastogne, St. Vith, the northern shoulder, had already been made before the worst of his own conditions set in. Much of the day-to-day burden during the crisis's worst days fell to his chief of staff, Major General William Keane, a demanding and by most accounts fairly ruthless administrator who kept the headquarters functioning. First Army was never formally relieved of Hodges' command, and Bradley never lost confidence in him. Whether that reflects well on Bradley's judgment, or simply on how little anyone outside First Army's own staff was watching closely enough to notice, I will leave for you to decide. The fighting that actually broke the German offensive's momentum, in my view, gets less attention than it deserves relative to Patton's much more famous relief march to Bastogne. The 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held Elsenborn Ridge on First Army's northern shoulder against repeated attacks by the 6th Panzer Army, the same army spearheaded by Piper, in fighting the historian John S.D. Eisenhower, the general's own son, who served in the theater and later wrote extensively on the campaign, called the single most decisive engagement of the entire Ardennes campaign. If Elsenborn Ridge breaks, the 6th Panzer Army reaches the Meuse River with a clear run at Antwerp. It did not break. That was Hodges' army, on Hodges' watch, holding a line that mattered more to the outcome of the battle than the ground around Bastogne that ended up on every newsreel. By March 1945, First Army had recovered fully enough to make the single most consequential tactical discovery of the entire campaign in Northwest Europe. On March 7th, elements of the 9th Armored Division reached the town of Remagen and found the Ludendorff railway bridge over the Rhine still standing, wired for demolition but not yet blown. The main charges failed to detonate. Under machine gun fire from both banks, infantrymen of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion rushed the span and secured it. Every Allied plan up to that point had assumed the Rhine, the last major natural barrier protecting the German interior, would require a deliberate, weeks-long set-piece crossing operation with heavy casualties. Hodges did not wait for that plan. He ordered every available unit across immediately.
Bradley, informed of the seizure, is reported to have told him simply to get as much across as he could. Over the following 10 days, roughly 25,000 troops with tanks and artillery crossed before the battered bridge finally collapsed under the accumulated strain on March 17th, killing 28 American engineers still working on it. By which point, First Army had already built 2 replacement pontoon bridges and held a bridgehead 40 kilometers wide. First Army then drove east and linked up with Ninth Army near Lippstadt on April 1st, closing the encirclement of the Ruhr pocket around Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B. Roughly 317,000 German soldiers surrendered, the largest mass surrender on the Western Front, larger in raw numbers than the German surrender at Stalingrad. Model dissolved his command rather than surrender personally and took his own life on April 21st. On April 25, 1945, soldiers of 1st Army's 69th Infantry Division made contact with the Soviet 58th Guards Rifle Division near Torgau on the Elbe River, cutting Germany in two and effectively ending the war in Europe. 10 days earlier, on April 15th, Hodges had been promoted to the full 4-star rank of general, one of only 2 men in the entire history of the United States Army, along with Walter Kruger, who commanded 6th Army in the Pacific, to rise from private to 4-star general. Kruger had enlisted during the Spanish-American War in 1898 and received his own 4th star roughly a month before Hodges did in 1945. Both men had climbed the exact same improbable ladder in different theaters of the same war, and both are, today, largely unknown outside dedicated military history circles, which I think tells you something about how little rising from private to 4-star general actually guarantees in terms of how history remembers you. The war in Europe over, MacArthur and the Joint Chiefs selected Hodges and 1st Army to lead the ground assault on the Japanese home islands in the planned invasion, Operation Coronet, meaning the American High Command, given the choice of every available field army commander for the single hardest amphibious assault ever contemplated, chose the man who had just spent 11 months fighting 1st Army's war. Japan surrendered before the invasion became necessary, but Hodges was aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, for the formal Japanese surrender, the only European theater army commander present for both German and Japanese surrenders. He retired in March 1949 after 43 years of service that began with a failed mathematics exam and ended with 2 surrender ceremonies on 2 different sides of the planet. In the years between Japan's surrender and his retirement, Hodges commanded 1st Army in its peacetime posting at Fort Jay on Governor's Island, New York, and later served as military advisor to Sir Owen Dixon, the United Nations mediator sent to resolve the Kashmir dispute between India and Pakistan. A strange, quiet coda for a man who 4 years earlier had commanded the largest field army the United States ever put into combat, now advising on a diplomatic dispute on the other side of the world with the same lack of fanfare that had defined everything else he did. He died in San Antonio on January 16, 1966, at 79. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 2, Grave 890-A. Here is the number that, more than any battle I've described, makes the case for revisiting this record at all. In Eisenhower's own confidential post-war ranking of 38 senior American officers by their fitness for future high command, compiled at the close of the Ardennes campaign, Hodges placed 11th. Behind Bradley, Patton, Mark Clark, Lucian Truscott, J. Lawton Collins, and Alexander Patch. 11th. The man commanding the largest American field army in the European theater, the army that took the first German city, made the first Rhine crossing, and closed the largest single encirclement of the war in the West, ranked 11th on his own theater commander's list. To be fair to Eisenhower, that ranking was meant to weigh future potential as much as wartime performance, and age worked against Hodges. He was 57 during the Bulge, older than most of the men ranked above him. But 11th is still a hard number to reconcile with the operational record, and I don't think age fully explains the gap. Omar Bradley, in his own post-war memoir, credited Hodges specifically as one of the most technically skilled commanders in the theater, writing that no unit in the war deserved more credit than 1st Army under his direction, and then went on to sell that memoir to a wide readership while Hodges wrote nothing at all. Eisenhower separately complained to Marshall, in real time, that Hodges was not getting the recognition his record warranted, and did nothing structural about it. No press arrangement, no push for Hodges to speak publicly.
The written record itself tells the same story from a different angle. His two aides, Major William Sylvan and Captain Francis Smith, kept a detailed daily diary of First Army's operations from June 2, 1944, through the German surrender, reviewed and approved by Hodges as they wrote it, and it sat unpublished for a general readership for over 60 years, finally reaching print only in 2008 as a specialist academic title few outside serious military history circles ever picked up. The one full biography, Stefan Wisniewski's 2006 study, makes a claim on its own back cover that nobody has seriously disputed: that Hodges was credited with capturing more ground than any other American commander in the entire war. None of it, not Bradley's praise, not Eisenhower's private frustration, not the diary, not the biography, ever reached the audience that made Patton's name a household word. That asymmetry is not usually a conspiracy. It is closer to a simple mechanism. Some commanders generate their own narrative, and some produce results and assume the results will speak for themselves. In a war fought on the front page as much as on the battlefield, only one of those two strategies survives in public memory. I'll leave you with the comparison I keep coming back to, because I think it's the fairest way to weigh this record. Third Army under Patton fought for 281 days. First Army under Hodges fought for 337, 56 days longer, through Normandy's hedgerows, the Hurtgen, and the worst of the Bulge, three of the costliest fights the American Army waged in Europe, rather than the largely open pursuit warfare that made Patton's name. That is not a case for erasing Patton's genuine skill as a pursuit commander. He had it, and this channel has said so before. It is a case for putting the record next to the reputation and asking whether they still match. I'd genuinely like to know, in the comments, whether you'd heard Hodges' name before today, and if your father or grandfather served under him in the 1st, 4th, 9th, 28th, or 106th Division, or anywhere else in First Army's 18 divisions. I'd like to hear that story too.